Hi, and welcome to our video on finding an additional material. This segment will be suitable for Year 12 Advanced English. So let's think about why the Board of Studies makes you choose an additional material for representation in text. The first thing is to reflect your wide reading. So you're supposed to read at least 10 texts on your own, maybe even more, that all have to do with the topic of representation in text, aside from the one you've been set. Now that may or may not be realistic for you depending on sort of your level of study, but you definitely need to get a couple together to show that you have sort of given it some consideration. So if you're going to choose 2 additional materials, which you know you need, you probably want to have at least one backup. Another reason we have additional material is to give your essay variety. Additional material is pretty much the only thing you get to pick. So we judge you pretty heavily based on that, and you really have to make sure you have an impressive choice. And probably one of the more important reasons you need additional material for this subject is so that you can make statements about representation in text across a range of text types and mediums. So keep in mind, thinking back to the module, medium is a huge part of this module. So you need to be able to show that you're not just talking about how representation works on the page, but maybe also with audio and visual. So now we're going to go through some do's and don'ts when it comes to selecting additional material for conflicting perspectives or history and memory. So, for conflicting perspectives, the first important thing is that both perspectives must be present in one text. So it's no good picking one additional material that says that Palestine has the right to live where it lives, and then one arguing for Israel taking over Palestine, because they're both presented in separate texts, and there's no real skill of representation there. They're only really showing one point of view. What you need is a text that has both points of view in one text. That's what we're looking for. Another thing you need to do is not pick texts with similar content. So if your first set text is on the Holocaust, you don't want to look for additional materials also to do with the Holocaust or Jewish persecution or anything sort of around that era. You want to go completely away from that topic and look for other things. Keep in mind you're supposed to cover events, personalities, and situations, so you're looking for diversity wherever possible. So keeping that in mind, if your set text is on an event, make sure that one of your additional materials is on a personality and another covers a situation. So a situation is a little bit of a confusing thing. So what does it mean? Well, the best way of thinking of it is anything that's not a personality or an event. But if you want to be a little bit more specific, it's things like a particular argument, or a long-held grudge, or gender issues, or cultural friction. So you might think about things like the identity crisis in terms of the evacuation of the English colony from India. So you could have the people who were sort of pro-colony and against colony, or people who were pro an older India view where there's a caste system and a more traditional lifestyle, or a pro more Western style view, which maybe some younger people in India have. So what you need to do is those sorts of things, they're not just one event, they're a long held situation with lots of different points of view and lots of effects. So that's probably the best way to think about a situation. When it comes to history and memory, you want to choose texts that are based on real persons, events, or situations. So that's kind of the first deal. It has to be in some way based on the truth. Now, it can be very, very scantily based on the truth. It can take the famous name of someone real and then make up a completely fictional life for them. So one of the things that might be really interesting is David Malouf's An Imaginary Life, in which they consider Ovid after he gets exiled. So Ovid was a real guy, he really did get exiled, but beyond that we really don't know. He died, that's the last thing we know about him. So all of the rest of that story is made up. So would we consider this under the basis of history and memory? So you might think yes, you might think no, but maybe then you can compare it to something like on the set text, The True History of the Kelly Gang, which Peter Carey happily admits he made up large chunks of. So the question of what's an appropriate additional material tends to come down to how creatively it's done and how much truth or how much sort of factual content there is. If you're having trouble with this, you want to sit down and discuss it with a teacher or tutor. You also want to choose texts that have a mixture of facts and personal memory as sources. It's very hard to have the history and memory debate if there's no memory in the text or if there's no history in the text. You also want to choose texts that use special text type techniques to represent memory. So things like italics to represent flashbacks, pictures as well as written words, maybe song lyrics or other cultural factors of the time, and maybe in, say, video flashbacks and things like that. So we're looking for things that actually employ the text type a little bit differently. A biography is great, but it's much more interesting if it's a biography with lots of creative components, and then it includes lots of different sources and lots of glamorous pictures and a couple of, things that you can argue about or have a different point of view about. You don't want everything to be completely black and white, or else it won't be very easy to make a case. Try to have one text again that covers an event, one that covers a personality, and one that covers a situation. So again, you want to keep it versatile, you want to keep your topics spread out, you don't want to be talking about the same thing all the time. So that's to do with your particular electives and the requirements for them. Now we're going to talk about, in general, the rules for choosing additional material. So you might not know that there are any rules. Sometimes when discussing it in class, we pretty much say, oh yeah, sure, you can bring in anything you want. But it's actually a really good idea to think very carefully about what you're going to pick, because, as we said, we do judge you pretty harshly on it. So the first thing to think about is that the text type should be different from your set text and from your other additional material choice. This always holds true, but it's particularly important in a subject like representation and text, where medium gets a lot of sort of importance and emphasis in the texts. If your set text is a novel, you could choose some poetry in a play, but not another novel, so you get the idea. You should have one older classic and one contemporary text for contrast. So when we say a classic, we mean 50 years old, the older the better, famous and generally considered literature, so it's got a good reputation. When we say contemporary, we mean less than 10 to 20 years old, the younger the better, and nominated or has won awards like the Oscars, Nobel Prizes for literature, the Booker Prize, or a Pulitzer. So you don't want to just pick your favorite text, you want to pick something that has a lot of oomph to it. Generally, it's always better to pick a complicated additional material than a simple one. And it does seem kind of illogical, but it's true. Cartoons, short simple poems, children's stories, they all end up being fairly tough to use because they don't have enough ideas in them to really adapt easily. So generally you'll find that they might have one conflicting perspective in them or one aspect of history and memory, so they'll work great for one kind of question, but they really don't have much to say on another. So now we're going to think about some text types to avoid choosing. So keep in mind that even though your teachers might have said these are okay, they're not. So what I mean by this is that if your teacher said it's okay, that means that maybe about half of the markers would be fine with you picking the text, but the other more conservative 50% wouldn't be okay with it. So when you're having to kind of hedge your bets here, it's better to go for the conservative choice to make sure you please the largest amount of people. So song lyrics, cartoons, and advertisements are all definitely too simple. Editorials and feature articles are basically media text types that are made in a hurry, so they're not a good idea. If you have a really thoughtful, long piece from the New Yorker, for instance, that took months and months of a person's life to write, that's fine. But if you're thinking about something that was just printed in the newspaper in the Sunday Telegraph, that's probably not so great. You also want to avoid dry non-fiction because it's too hard to find text type techniques. Now, of course, if you're doing something like history and memory, you could argue that it's all non-fiction. But there's a difference between dry non-fiction, which is very serious, very factual, and sort of doesn't elaborate on anything. There's a difference between that and what we call creative non-fiction, which has got more of a literary style and perhaps even takes a little bit more liberty with the truth sometimes. So really, rather than picking the dry non-fiction, you want to pick the creative non-fiction type. You also want to avoid Shakespeare, because basically there is such a thing as too complicated. Also avoid pop culture, teen, or children's film or books. So you don't want to do teen films or young adult literature because it just smacks of you being slightly immature and your teachers probably won't be very approving. Children's books, yes, sometimes they're beautifully illustrated and they have a great story, but again, it kind of implies that your reading level is at a certain level and that it doesn't go any higher. So it doesn't really say good things about you. Keep in mind that most pop culture texts are not particularly well made and most of them are going to evoke disapproval from your markers. So even if it's a brilliant story that just happens to be animated, and trust me, there are lots of those, don't take the risk.